Night had fallen over the nation when the story of two very different men to names carved into America's long, troubled history of violence rose back into public conversation. One had finally reached the end of a blood-stained road stretching across multiple states. The other, locked away for nearly 4 decades, now faced a haunting question: was he competent enough to die? Both stories unfolded quietly at first, in institutional hallways and government documents, yet their echoes carried across the country, stirring old grief, reopening wounds, and forcing Americans to confront the dark spaces where justice, morality, and human frailty collide. Glenn Edward Rogers, a cross-country killer. In early 2025, when the news broke that Glenn Edward Rogers had been executed, the announcement came like a cold wind across courtrooms, living rooms, and the memories of those who had followed his crimes for decades. Rogers was no ordinary criminal. Nicknamed the cross-country killer, he had drifted from state to state in the 1990s, leaving behind a trail of brutality, charm, manipulation, and shattered families. For years, Americans had watched documentaries, heard prison interviews, and read investigative reports about Rogers, the drifter with a violent temper and a silver tongue, the man who could buy a stranger a drink one moment and end their life the next. He was a ghost moving along highways, slipping into bars, motels, and unsuspecting lives. His crimes were so scattered and unpredictable that some investigators once thought multiple killers were responsible. But the truth came out in fragments: a waitress who remembered his smile, a bartender who recalled his sudden mood swings, police in one state who recognized him from reports in another. By the time he was finally convicted of murder, the myth of Glenn Rogers had grown almost as large as the man himself. Some believed he was far more prolific than his charges reflected. Others insisted he exaggerated his own violence, hungry for notoriety. But for the families of victims, there was nothing mythical about the pain he caused. On the day of his execution, the prison was silent in that heavy, institutional way, fluorescent lights humming, guards speaking in clipped tones, the air thick with the weight of finality. Witnesses filed into the execution chamber. Some had waited decades for this moment. Others arrived trembling, and sure if closure was something death could truly offer. Rogers was brought in, shackled, thinner than the images burned into the nation's memory. Years of incarceration had aged him, carving deep lines into his face, softening the swagger that once defined him, yet his eyes still held something. And settling something unreadable, the room settled into stillness. A warden read the final statement. Some expected remorse, others expected defiance. But what came was somewhere in between, cryptic, fragmented, a man who had lived too long with his own story to let anyone else shape its final chapter. As the chemicals began their slow work, a strange quiet filled the room. A quiet that made some witnesses grip their seats, others clench their fists, and still others whisper the names of loved ones under their breath. When it was over, reporters stepped outside into the cold night, broadcasting the final line of a case that had haunted investigators for over 30 years. Families, spread across multiple states, received the news with a mixture of relief, sorrow, and the ache of something irreversible. Justice had been served. But justice, as always, is never as clean as the textbooks describe. Rogers' story did not end with his death. His name lingered online, in documentaries, in discussions about the death penalty, in questions about how many victims would never be identified, how many families would never have answers. And as America absorbed the closure of one chapter, another story quietly pushed into view. 2. Ralph Menzies, for decades on death row in Utah, far from the execution chamber where Rogers' story ended, another man waited for a decision that had hung over him since the late 1980s. Ralph Leroy Menzies. For younger Americans, his name might have been unfamiliar. But to Utah residents, to the families connected to the case, and to those who remembered the crime, Menzies was a figure frozen in time, locked forever in the same chilling moment. In 1986, Menzies kidnapped and murdered a woman named Maureen Hunsaker, a mother, a wife, a human being whose life had been stolen in a violent, senseless act. The details of the crime were brutal, the evidence damning, and Menzies was sentenced to death in 1988. 37 years passed. 37 years of court filings, appeals, reversals, delays. 37 years in a tiny cell, where time moved differently, slow for some, suffocating for others. But by 2025, a new question had reached the courts. Was Menzies mentally competent enough to be executed? The law required a person to understand the punishment being carried out. Executing someone who did not comprehend their fate would violate constitutional protections. And so, psychologists, attorneys, judges, and experts entered a complex maze of evaluations, interviews, medical records, and contradictory reports. Some said Menzies understood perfectly well what awaited him. Others said decades in solitary confinement had eroded his mental clarity, leaving him incapable of rational comprehension. Meanwhile, the victim's family, now older, carrying nearly 4 decades of grief, waited. They had grown up, aged, built lives of their own, but never left behind the moment that stole Maureen from them. For them, competency hearings were not abstract legal discussions, they were painful extensions of a nightmare that had never fully ended. As the evaluation continued in 2025, Menzies sat in a state prison surrounded by mountains, the Utah winter pressing coldly against concrete walls. His world was smaller than ever, a bunk, a toilet, a tray of food, a routine that repeated endlessly. For him, time did not feel like a river. It felt like a circle. Around and around. And changing. Unrelenting. The possibility of execution hovered above him like a storm cloud, sometimes distant, sometimes crackling with electricity, always present. The legal world buzzed with speculation. Would Utah carry out one of its oldest death sentences? Would the courts rule that a man who spent nearly 4 decades on death row was competent to face execution? And if so, what would it mean for the future of capital punishment? The state waited. So did the family. So did the country. To men. To stories. To very different paths. But in early 2025, they collided in the national conversation about justice, punishment, healing, and the limits of the death penalty. Glenn Edward Rogers was gone, his story closed, his victims remembered, his trail of violence finally ending where the law had been waiting for him. Ralph Menzies remained still caught in a legal, moral, and psychological battle that raised impossible questions. How long is too long on death row? What does it mean to be competent to die? And can a justice system designed by humans ever fully balance punishment with humanity? No matter what happens next, America watches. Victims' families hold their breath, courts deliberate, and the nation continues wrestling with the darkest stories its citizens leave behind.